And I'm very honored and pleased and happy and joyful to introduce to you Professor Ilan Troen. Ilan is the Carl, Harry, and Helen Stoll Chair in Israel Studies and the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, which is a huge new endeavor to develop the whole field of Israel Studies, and in a way he really leads that new project in the United States, and he does it very well. Ilan formerly served as the director of the Ben-Gurion Research Institute and Archive in Sde Boker in the Negev in Israel, and founding dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ben-Gurion University. He is the founding editor of Israel Studies, an international journal sponsored by the Brandeis University and Ben-Gurion University, which is the best out of the four journals that deal with Israel Studies.
An exaggeration.
He has a serious. Wait to the second sentence. He's going to have a serious competition as of next year. He doesn't know yet, but that's the old new journal which we are producing here, Israel Studies Review, together with Paul Shem that you all know. But I think that it will take us at least 3 or 4 years to overcome the challenge.
The competition is good.
Anyhow, besides that, of course, he has authored and edited a dozen of books in American, Jewish, and Israeli history, including most recently Imagine Zion, Dreams, Designs, and Realities in a Century of Jewish Settlement. Another book is he edited with Jacob Lesner, Jews and Muslims in the Arab World. And his next book with Maoz Azaryahu from Haifa or Tel Aviv? From Haifa University.
He lives in Tel Aviv.
Will be published by Indiana University Press this spring. And the title is Tel Aviv, the First Century, Dreams, Designs, and Actualities. And I guess that the topic that we're going to hear today is a topic that which will end up in a new book, which will come after the book on Tel Aviv.
Right.
So we are honored to be the first one to listen to read the book, which will take probably 2 years, if not more. Academic presses takes long time before they publish the books. Ilan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The book will probably come out when you catch up with Israel Studies. Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. Yoram Perry has really put on the international map this program of Israel Studies at Maryland. Not that it wasn't on the map before, but it's like Tal Brody. One of the most famous sayings in Israeli history is that when Israel beat Moscow around 30 or so years ago, he said that we are on the map. It's not like Israel wasn't on the map, but you're on the map when you beat Moscow. And I don't want to continue with that competitive stream anymore because I see Yoram as a friend, and all of you as friends. In fact, I see some friends here from Brandeis and from my neighborhood across the fields, from Lakia to Omer, and other people that I've known in different parts of my life. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is a project that I'm engaged in. There was a subtitle to the book I did with Jack Lassler on Jews and Muslims in the Arab world, and the subtitle was Haunted by Pasts, Real and Imagined. And that notion of being haunted by pasts, real and imagined, is really part of the background to my interest in how people claim land. And the previous book was a book on the history of Zionist settlement. So there are two pieces of what have concerned me over the last number of years that will go into this current project. And let me tell you in brief what it is that I intend on talking about, and at least what it's not excites, it aggravates my imagination. And that is how people argue about land. Jews and Arabs aren't the only people who argue about land. A lot of other people throughout the world do. You can live in Australia, and Aborigines and the settlers, or you can be an Eskimo, or you can live in Belgium. You can live anywhere in the world. and the issue of to whom does this land belong is a salient concern. And in thinking about this and doing some reading, I think there are two categories, two ways in which people argue about land. And the first is they argue about land in religious terms, theology. And that is terribly important because throughout almost all of human history, that was actually the only way in which people argued about land. That God gave us the right to it. It was until sometime in the 19th century, or actually the end of the 18th century, that I don't know of a society, certainly societies that I'm familiar with, where the justification for the rights of a ruler were not in some way invested with the authority given by the divine. It was divine sanction, divine legitimacy. The notion of Deo volente, God wills it, or Be'ezrat Hashem, Inshallah, whatever it might be, there were all these formulas. You couldn't form a human society unless you invoked God's will. The first society to break away from that is really the one that we're living in right now. When you take a look at the Mayflower Compact, 1620 pilgrims on board that ship coming across the ocean, and it is a religious document. They invoke God as the justification for creating the revolutionary phrase was a civil body politic. By the time you get to the revolution, God is expunged. And America may be the first society that I know of, certainly, where its existence and its sanction comes from something other than the divine, ultimately. After all, how does the Constitution begin? We the people. And if you read the whole phrase of we the people, the legitimacy for this society comes from the will of the people, whoever those people might be. When Americans formulated that, they did not yet have the notion of peoplehood in the sense of nation. But they knew that there was another way to justify what they were doing. And what I plan to do is to talk the way in which Jews and Palestinians, or if you're not Jews and Palestinians, not yet, Jews, Muslims, and Christians make claims for that same land. And the interesting point is that the most interesting arguments are not between Jews and Muslims and Christians. The most interesting arguments are within the Christian, the Muslim, and the Jewish communities. And in fact, to say that Jews argue this way, or Christians argue that way, or Muslims argue another way, is a mistake. That there is no such thing as the Jewish claim, the Christian claim, the Muslim claim. There are conflicting versions within. So I'll spend a good deal of time talking about that. The second issue is secular arguments. And secular arguments really emerge after the American Revolution, and the single best formulation I know is by Justice Marshall in the 1830s in the Cherokee land cases, where he argues in a totally secular way why it is that the United States has justification for being the master of this continent and beyond. And he gives a number of reasons that I'll spell out. And those are important because ultimately, religious discourse is internal. You can ultimately only really make claims on your community of believers. There's no reason in the world why a Christian ought to believe that he can persuade a Jew, or a Jew can persuade a Muslim, and so on and so forth. Those are internal discussions. It is secular discourse over the last 200 years, which is the discourse that comes before international bodies, international courts. Sure, you couldn't go to the United Nations or the League of Nations and say, my religion tells me. What difference does it make? But you have to find a universal language, and that language is the language of secular discourse. The next to the last point, and the last points are very, very short, is that for all of this, and I'll use a phrase that I really learned from Paul Sham in our conference in Istanbul, that what one really has when one analyzes all of this are parallel discourses or parallel narratives. And parallel narratives never really meet. They actually coexist. And the final point is something I learned from a colleague with whom you worked with or at Beersheba, which was Dan Benor, who Dan Baron, who told us that even though parallel narratives do not resolve anything, they do make us more sensitive to what other people are thinking, and there's a great deal to be gained by learning, being sensitive to somebody else's beliefs. In fact, that sensitivity enables genuine action rather than trying to resolve all the arguments. So let me begin. That's really the outline of what I want to say. And let me begin with religion. And the place to begin, not just because it's the older one, is because the religious claims within Judaism have been adopted by other religions, and in fact they reflect other religions. And in terms of Judaism, it comes from the notion of the covenant. The covenant was that agreement made between Jews, Abraham, and his God. And the covenant meant that there were certain obligations placed upon Abraham, and there were certain obligations placed upon Abraham's God. Abraham was supposed to obey, and he did so sometimes almost in a brutal way. If you would ever ask Isaac of how faithful Abraham was, you'd get a very tearful answer. And God also had obligations, not the least of which that this land would be the land for Abraham and his succeeding generations. That notion of covenant has been with the Jews for a couple of thousand years. Of the notion of mutual response, even the exile is interpreted as being a consequence of covenant. The failure to fulfill the covenant is the reason for the exile. But the covenant is everlasting, and the return may occur again. There is a second part that one gets out of Judaism, which is universal, and that is the interpretation given to the first words of the Bible, Bereshit bara Elokim. That's the Yeshiva Bocha Yoram. And if you look at the commentary about 1,000 years ago, Rashi, a medieval French commentator, says, why does the Bible begin with, in the beginning God created? And Rashi gives us an answer which is dependent upon a commentary which is 1,000 years earlier. And his answer is because it's a way of saying that the earth is the Lord's. And the word is listim, if you look it up in Rashi, so that the pirates won't come and say, this land is mine. In the beginning, God created. The earth is the Lord's. It is He who decides to whom the world belongs. Now, Rashi may have in mind the Crusaders who were trying to go, doing all kinds of acts, terrible acts, at least in his mind. But whatever it is, that notion of the earth as the Lord's is a deeply held religious view. And it is the Lord who assigns land to any particular people. So that's the beginning. What do you do with this, and how do Jews interpret it? First of all, there's no one interpretation. What I'd like to do is take a very quick survey of the kinds of views that religious Jews have over what all of that might mean. In the first case, Orthodoxy accepts without any question that there is a real and vital relationship between Jews and that particular land. I don't have to spell this out, the holidays, any number of times in the prayers, it's in literature, repeated, I don't think, literally countless times over millennia. The question is how do Jews get back there, and when they get back there, and by whom that return is affected. And if you take ultra-Orthodoxy, for example, the really religious Jews, I don't accept that, I'm saying that snidely, because all Jews can be religious, but there are many ways of doing it. But the Jews who wear uniforms as they engage in their practice in their Judaism would tell you that ultimately we don't know when the return will come, the ingathering of the exiles, the Messiah will come. We know it will come, and the land will again become a place where it'll become a theocracy. The Messiah is the intermediary. And indeed, this belief meant that ultra-Orthodoxy is fundamentally opposed to Zionism. You wait for God to do it. And some of the expressions of this are absolutely extraordinary. The most extreme is the Ture Karta, which probably more people talk about it than they're worth in terms of their numbers. It's only, a couple hundred people or families in a small corner of Jerusalem. They would support the PLO because they think that they do support the PLO because Zionism is a terrible intrusion in the sense of trying to upset God's plan for history. Or you take a less extreme view, the Satmar Hungarian Hasidim, who argue that without a demonstrable proof, that the Holocaust is proof that Zionism was a mistake, because here you have Jews engaging in the arrogance of trying to determine the end of history, which is the fulfillment of the covenant, and therefore Zionism was a blasphemy. So you could believe that the land is ours as Jews, but you can see Zionism and everything that has been going on there for the last 100+ years as a challenge to God and God's plan. And therefore it should not happen. You claim it in the abstract in the future, but not now. All kinds of other possibilities beyond that. You could be a religious Zionist and argue, and I'm going to make this very short but very dramatic, there are two fundamental parties in Israel today. One, unfortunately, is larger than the other, and I won't share with you the size because you already know. The Bloc of the Faithful, Gush Emunim, and the other one is Meimad. And both of them, their positions can be summarized in a wonderful confrontation that I saw in Jerusalem at Van Leer when Yochanan Porat spoke with Avi Ravitsky. And Avi Ravitsky, they were both explaining the differences between two religious Zionist movements. And after Porat, who was one of the early leaders of Gush Emunim and the settlement project in the West Bank, got off explaining that I believe that there will ultimately be a theocratic state, that we have to realize God's will now. Avi Ravitsky got up and said the following. He says, look, you and I were students at the yeshiva of Rav Kook at exactly the same time. In fact, we studied in the same group. You and I are friends. You and I agree on all the essential points. That is, we believe in the same future. The difference between you and me is you know when that promised moment is going to take effect, and you know by whom. I don't know when, and I certainly don't believe that I am the agent of divine intervention. So you can have very similar beliefs, you can read the same texts, but you can come out in a very, very different place about what the significance of that is for human action today. Another group that's interesting, and I would put him in terms of religious Zionism, and that is Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a rabbi, and he would have understood himself as an Orthodox rabbi. However, other people may have interpreted him. And Martin Buber also believed in the covenant. In fact, he believed in the covenant, elevated the covenant as the core of his theology. And the part of that was that Jews ought to return to this land, and they must inhabit into it. They must inhabit it. And I could go on all listing the various aspects of it, but I assume that there are some Hebrew speakers here, and if you're not, you're going to learn something right now. The word for man is Adam or Adam, but if you add a hey to it, you get Adamah. The hey stands like in the Hallelujah, that the end H of it really is the Hebrew for God. But if you put Adamah is really man and God, it's earth. And a man cannot take territory unless he does so in an ethical way. And so that his conception of the way in which Jews would recapture, return to their patrimony, their promised patrimony, was only in an ethical manner. He had a couple of other interesting views. He thought that the function of returning Jews to that land would be, first of all, the fulfillment of the promise made to Jews. Secondly, that in that promised land, Jews could had a mission, and that mission was to be a light unto the nations, that they'd have to create a just society. And thirdly, he thought that, and this becomes very important, it helps explain why the kibbutzniks really liked him so much. He argued that the taking of land in itself was an ethical exercise, that making deserts bloom, cultivating land, was in itself something that had moral worth, and that was not only Jewish, but anyone could do that. And indeed, without going to a lecture in American history, if you would read Jonathan Winthrop or Thomas Jefferson, both of them with very significant differences, understood that the coming to the North America and the creation of generations of farmers was also a moral act that had important social consequences. My point in telling you all of this, of course, you know that Martin Buber was for a binational state, not for Jewish territoriality. So you have Maimad supports compromise. In fact, traditionally, at least until present, the burden of Orthodox Jewry in Israel supported partition. Some would want it all, some would agree to partition, some argued for binationalism, some argued for staying away entirely. All of them are Jews, and all of them are arguing from the same texts. There is no such thing as the Jewish view of the rightfulness of our claims to the land. Christianity, I speak with far less authority. So I hope I don't offend anybody, or I hope more importantly than being offensive is being wrong, is that there's also, of course, a wide disparity of views within Christianity. The earlier Christian views are rooted in replacement theology. That is, that there was a new church, the true church. Jesus spoke in universal terms. Did Jesus ever say, the Jews are going to return to this land? There was already a diaspora at that time. That God promised this land to Jews? Does he speak in terms of the covenant? Jesus speaks in terms, a universal language. It's all the poor who should inherit. All of us must do justice. All of us must be righteous. He doesn't speak in a Jewish text. This is terribly important, because the notion is that Christianity brings a universal message. Judaism spoke in a far more parochial mode. And if you understand that Christianity becomes the replacement, or to use the technical term, the supersessionist, that it is the replacement, the one that supersedes Judaism, then that means that with Jesus, all the promises that God made to Abraham have been fulfilled. And indeed, you can read some branches of Christianity, and that the function of Jews is to be witnesses in history. Eventually, that turns up as the notion of being fossils, and I could make that in Toynbee's terms, which is, again, a Christian kind of interpretation. And Jews are not actors in history anymore. They bear witness, and sometimes they suffer as they bear witness for the sins that an earlier generation made. But that, of course, is not entirely all of Christianity, is it? For after all, we do know that among the major supporters for Zionism in the state of Israel in the United States today are fundamentalists. I lectured in Texas last week, and there were a lot of Zionists in the room, Christian Zionists. So how can you be a Christian Zionist? You read one part of the text and you forget about other talk, which is, by the way, what everybody does. You can't read the whole Bible in the same, you have to choose which part of the Bible you want to emphasize. So you read the book of Revelations, and you know there's a divine plan, and that Jews have their history to play. Jews are not fossils. They are actors in history, and they're very important actors in history. And they're necessary actors in history, because they are going to realize God's plan, and God's plan is to bring about the Armageddon, and we must support the Jews in Israel because they are acting out this divinely inspired drama. Well, without going through the whole range of views, let me just choose two. The second is Palestinian liberation theology, Naim Atik. Naim Atik is a Palestinian Christian, I think actually a Lutheran, supported very much by a whole variety of other groups, who argues a form of supersessionism. The Jews have disappeared in a real sense. He sees no connection between the Jews of the present and the Jews of the past. In any case, the real inhabitants of the authentic inhabitants of the land are people who have a name like his. Atik, of course, means in Arabic and in Hebrew it means ancient or old, and he will tell you that he is actually a descendant from somebody who was in the Holy Land at the time of Christ. and that as being the authentic native, he interprets the Bible in an entirely different way. His favorite trope is the Exodus story. Now, some people in this room maybe will be saying the Exodus story in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But if you are an Arab Christian, a member of Palestinian theology, you will see that the true enactment of the Exodus story is when the Palestinians come home. When they can return from their exile, from their servitude, to recapture their own land. And thus the Bible becomes a kind of text for explaining the verisimilitude, the veracity, the authenticity of the Palestinian political position. In fact, liberation theology is really adopted out of Central America after the Second World War. It undergoes some transformation, and you have, rather than the Yankee imperialists and the downtrodden Central American peasants who are oppressed and so on and so forth, you have different actors, but the drama is much the same. In between is the Catholic Church, which I find interesting. The Catholic Church did not recognize the State of Israel. In fact, it actively promoted the vote against it. Fortunately, and I say this as a Jew, and I'll say this candidly, evidently Catholics observe birth control as much as they do the kind of political dictum that comes out of the Vatican, because Israel would not have come into existence had the Catholics voted the way in which the Pope told them to, which was against a Jewish state. Yet, there's a change in our own time, and that change is in the 1960s, Nostrum Aetate, where Jews are allowed to return to history. Jews are no longer blamed for the sins, for the crime that occurred nearly 2,000 years ago. The little brother now has a role in history. He's an actor in history. Among the many people who come to our seminar on Israel studies are Catholic universities in America, who have increasingly a place in their departments, people who will teach about Israel, not as a text of something of text created by dead people, but actually is a living entity. But it's limited. The Catholic Church made ties with Israel right after Oslo, I think it's 1994, but it's still difficult. My favorite document is a document that is 2002, and I might even remember the name of it, and if I don't, I'll give it to you now. And I can see I'm taking too much time, so I better talk a little bit more quickly. It's called The Sacred Obligation, which is a fascinating kind of compromise. It argues, one, God's covenant with the Jewish people endures forever. This denies supersessionism, that the Jews still live and they still have a covenant. Two, Judaism is a living modern faith enriched by centuries of development. It's not only a faith that's been fossilized, it lives and it grows. Three, ancient rivalries must not define Christian-Jewish relations. Particularly Christian worship that teaches contempt for Judaism dishonors God. And this is what's significant for this discussion, for the land of Israel is central to the life of the Jewish people. What this means is that Palestine, Israel, is the legitimate abode for both Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. What the document doesn't say is recognize the legitimacy of the State of Israel. And it becomes the way in which the church still elides the difficult reality of Jews claiming sovereignty in their own land. Well, I've just a little bit about Christianity, give you the range of views, the difficulty of negotiating the historical event that shouldn't have happened, that 2,000 years later Jews come back and claim that they are returning. Is there a Christian view? Most certainly not. There are several Christian views, and they go from one extreme of the spectrum to the other extreme. Muslim claims. Here I'm even on shakier ground. And after all, it's the Muslim claims that are the most important one, because 90% of the Arab population, and since at least 90% of the Arab population between the Jordan and Mediterranean is Muslim, it is Islam, not Christianity, which is the primary concern of Israel. The views, there's also the notion the important distinction, the important contribution that maybe I can make to a subject that I wish I knew a great deal about is that the variety of views within Islam regarding who has rights to that particular land. And I'm going to do it in a shorthand by giving you the extreme case. And the extreme case is the Hamas. The Hamas have done something which evidently, and so I read, and Yitzhak Reiter is my source, has never occurred in all of Islam. Jews have lived within Islam. They've bought land. They've negotiated. They've lived in Jerusalem. They've lived throughout the Arab world. But only in the last 20 years has there actually been a theological opinion arguing that all of Terra Sancta, all of Eretz HaKodesh, all of the Holy Land is a waqf. That is to say that this land is a religious beneficence and that is forbidden for Jews to own and indeed to live in it. That never happened. For indeed, if you take a look at the history of even of the 20th century, Jews purchased a great deal of land, or the land that they had before the creation of the state, from whom? From Christian and from Muslim Arabs, not the least of which the Mufti of Jerusalem was one of the major sellers of land, he and his family, to Jews. So surely the notion of Jews being active and being neighbors and being part of this large family, to be their relationship in the family was decidedly inferior. After all, they are dhimmis. They are people of the book, but they have rights and they have status. They may not have sovereignty. That may be the binding notion, at least in the theological Islam, and the theological aspects of it is that the notion that Jews would have an independent state in Dar al-Islam, or the abode of Islam, is a theological impossibility. How they live within the abode of Islam, that's open to interpretation. So Islam is really with a far greater confrontation, though there is still variety, because after all, there are Muslims who have negotiated with Jews. Sadat was a devout Muslim, and he made a peace treaty with Jews. King Hussein was considered himself some place in the heritage of the generation of the Prophet, and he made a treaty with Jews. So that it is entirely possible that within Islam that the ways can be found where devout and believing and representative Muslims can come to terms with a Jewish state. And there is also a clear example, and that's the Hamas, who argue that that's an absolute impossibility and that the only proper course is conflict, war, and so on. So what do we get out of all of this? I hope out of confusion. The way in which throughout most of humanity we've talked about land is that we need a justification, we need divine authority, we need divine sanction. But how do we also talk about it in the present period? And that is in secular terms. Let me come to my favorite person in all of this, Justice John Marshall, Supreme Court, 1830s. The famous case is the Cherokee land cases, and he argues the following. And by the way, it's fitting that Americans would deal with this. After all, America is the first modern nation. It comes into being without divine sanction. There's no notion of a covenant. There may be something called divine providence. It may have been intended, or some actor, nature's God may have been involved in this, but there is nothing that says that this is, the word Jesus never appears in the Declaration of Independence. I would submit to you that is revolutionary. People like Jefferson consider themselves agnostics, deists, the flimsiest, the most tenuous relationship to religion, let alone to a particular one. And also they took a land away from somebody else. How do you justify taking the North American continent, not only from the Indians, but you also took it from the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and ultimately even the Russians, though you paid money to the Russians. So in short, here you have a society that's going across a continent. How does it justify itself? And what I'd submit to you is that what Marshall expresses in the Cherokee land cases, which were about the Cherokee Indians in the state of Georgia, whose land was being encroached upon by white future Georgians, I'd like to think the ancestors of Jimmy Carter, And the kind of conflict that resulted from that kind of meeting was a theory of how one claims land, which I would argue is the regnant theory throughout the world today. It's the kind of theory which comes before the courts, which comes before the United Nations. It's the language. The first way in which one can take land, we tend not to want to talk about it very much today, is through conquest. That's obvious. 2, through treaty. You can get people to agree. And you know what the Americans did, of course, is that they invented the Iroquois nation, that they manufactured out of the Indians in upstate New York. They manufactured them into tribes, and from the tribes, it has to do with families. We were talking earlier. You manufacture them into a group which is recognized in your law so that you can make a treaty with them and take their land away. So the Americans invented nations out of the Indians they found here. But treaties that we found in many historic experiences. Thirdly, you can buy the land. Pay $24 to the Indians and you get Manhattan. You pay a couple of million to the French, you get all of the land, nearly all of the land west of it's not the Mississippi. Sure, it's the Mississippi. You pay some rubles to the Russians and you buy Alaska. Or you can, any other kind of transaction. A transaction is legitimate. And then there's another reason, and this becomes actually the most interesting of all, and very, very germane to the Arab-Israeli conflict. He argued that you can take land by invoking Locke's second treatise of government. In the second treatise of government by John Locke, which was read by all American leaders at the time of the Revolution, the way in which you can claim land is by labor, by investing your sweat, your blood, your tears. Hafrachat shmama. You turn the desert, you make the desert bloom. And the theory goes like this. There are all kinds of people who can live in land. There are nut gatherers, there are shepherds, and there are farmers. What's the difference? Nut gatherers don't invest any labor. Shepherds, if you've ever been a shepherd, and I can claim to be a shepherd in the Negev, not with a flute, but with a portable radio, and I didn't write great poetry. But in any case, shepherds, and believe me, shepherds work particularly in the morning and especially in the evening when they try to get the sheep back in. And thirdly, it's the farmers. It's the farmers who, by the sweat of their brow and the risk in their labor. And there's a hierarchy. In short, everybody has right to land, but there's a differential set of rights. And if you read American history, I won't go back to Jonathan Winthrop, this country is unimaginable without that. Thomas Jefferson, the agrarian yeomanry, the creation of democracy, the political institutions and the social culture derives out of the farmers going across the continent, ultimately through the Homestead Act and so on and so forth, and investing themselves in that land. That, of course, will become a terribly important argument in the Arab-Israeli dispute, and it has to deal with the issue of the economic absorptive capacity of Palestine, how many people the land can actually hold, and do Jews actually get rights not merely by buying, but by making the desert bloom. That's a wonderful secular argument, and it had terrific appeal in the world in the early part of the 20th century. These then become the kind of principles and a language that you can talk about treaties. And there were treaties, the Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations, the United Nations. That's where you go, and they determine. And we can go on with this, but you know all of that. My point is, and I'll try to make it very brief, is that having secular language does not forestall arguments. And particularly, there's one part of the argument that that Marshall did not bring forward, but there were a legion of other people at the same time in the 19th century who did marshal forward. I didn't mean that as a pun. Who did employ in arguing for land, and that is the argument of history. History supplants theology in the 19th century, and this is the age of nationalism. There isn't a national movement that did not claim its historic rights. Historic rights don't claim a hell of a lot. If you would like to prove a hell of a lot, if you would read the opening paragraph of the PLO covenant, and you will read about that the Palestinian, the birthplace of the Palestinian people is in that contested land. Should you read the first paragraph of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, it says the same thing. And that one can argue over history, indeed, as Bedouins and in the state of Israel do. Were the Bedouins and in what numbers in the 18th century? And did they make claim to the land? But nevertheless, it gives rise to a new category of thought which goes well beyond the notion of being God's anointed, and it is the sanctity invested in words like natives and aborigines. And it is in that kind of language that many disputes are also adjudicated, or they fester, because history can be used as a professional historian. Without historiography, which means the debates of historians, we are nothing. We have to argue. It's like you can't have one lawyer, you always need another lawyer. Well, historians need other historians if they're to be creative and make a contribution. I could go through all of these, and let me just take a couple of them very, very briefly about why they resolve very, very little. The issue of history. To whom and let me match up history with the issue. I only have time for one example, and let me use I'll use history, and let me begin with Antonius. That the most important secular argument against Zionism that came out to the world was Antonius in 1938. And what is his argument? His argument is a secular version of Christianity. His argument is that the Jews have disappeared. Contemporary Jews have no claims. That Jews went out into dispersion, and those people who claim connection with the land are not authentic, and they have no claims, and the land belongs to the natives who have been here since time immemorial. That argument, rooted in history, not in theology, appropriate, if you will, to a Christian Arab, has been picked up by a whole variety of people. From Antonius to Edward Said, you get the same argument. Indeed, this argument about the place of Jews in history, where they are and where they come from, becomes central to secular debates. The argument is that, in effect, the Jews are a colonial settler society. And the colonial settler argument is probably the most potent of the secular arguments against a Jewish state. And there's some great deal of irony in that, because the secular arguments that Zionism used so successfully, that persuaded the world community, were arguments based on the categories that really Marshall created. First of all, Jews claimed that they were a people, and being a people is the most crucial argument that you could make in claiming land. Wilson's 14 points, I skipped a lot. All of those points talk about human rights? No. Civil rights? No. Personal rights? No. They talk about the rights of nations, the rights of peoples. The way in which you claim land in the modern world is by being a people. And what Jews had to do was to prove that they were a people, not in theological terms, in terms of the covenant, but a historic people. And how did they do it? They spoke Hebrew. They recreated the Hebrew language. They came to the land. There is no New Bialystok, New Poland, New Warsaw, no New England, no Maryland, none of that. There's no place in Europe that's really marked in the Jewish or the Zionist landscape. There are names that derive from the Bible or from a variety of experiences in the present or in Jewish history. You go to the streets of Jerusalem, and you go to one section where there are streets named for the mothers, streets named for the forefathers, streets named for the 12 tribes of Israel. In short, the whole landscape is marked with something that resonates with Jewish experience through history. So where does that come to? It comes to the notion by which ultimately Jews won recognition for a Jewish state. And it's one word, it's in the League of Nations Charter, and it is the word reconstitute. That the reason why the League of Nations, before that Balfour, and afterwards the United Nations, made legitimate by treaty, by law, a Jewish state, because it was a place where Jews could reconstitute themselves. Reconstitute, and I know Garrett has heard this before, reconstitute is composed of two parts. The re is the word again in Latin. Constitute is shape. That this is an ancient people that actually existed in history. And it exists in history, but as a place where they may return, reclaim, rebuild. The notion of re is the most important part of those words. It's something that may happen again, and that we validate the connection of these people to this land. And thus the secular arguments are attempts in effect to disassociate Jews from the land. And a colonial settler case is the colonial settler argument is the key argument is that Jews are fundamentally Europeans. They are like other groups, they're like the Portuguese and the Dutch and so on and so forth. And as I like to say, is that you can't be a little bit pregnant. Either you are or you're not, and either Jews are colonizers and colonialists and imperialists, or they're not, except if you read history differently. If you read history not in terms of the frame of the last 500 years and see them as the last of the Europeans, but if you read history in terms of the thousands of years of collective human experience. And here, I'm not going to do it, but we could talk about the way in which the Bible, as a secular document, and archaeology as a secular science, is used both as a science privileging and a science denying the Jewish connection to the land. What all of this means. I said that I would use Paul Sham's notion of parallel narratives. I think there are many stories that can be told, and we could argue about which is true. Probably none are 100% true. There's an important negotiation, and it's a lifelong work. I think the important message for me to you, or me to myself, because I happen to live there as well, and we're neighbors, some of us are neighbors, is that one has to really listen seriously and take seriously how other people imagine themselves and construct themselves. And you may say that what they have to say is wrong. There's no archaeological evidence. Or there is, we can't bring it to a court of law and prove it. But people are people, and people have their beliefs. And what that really means to me is that to take the notion of parallel, in parallel lines in nature and in geometry never meet. But they can, and they do, and they must coexist. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. The famous director of Tichon Chadash in Tel Aviv used to say, "Shnei kavim magbilim nikagda yipageshu." It's a mixture of Hebrew and Russian. Okay, wonderful topic, very interesting. I'm sure we have some questions to ask our speaker. So, who has the courage to be the first one? Sure, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. These different narratives are a lot of times overlapping. I mean, the secular and the religious, and when you look at modern Israel today, there's this change there, because you used to think of this overlap. The more religious Israelis would have the same narrative, would combine the secular and the religious ones. After the Russian immigration to Israel, the Russians being more secularly, I'm talking of course of parts of Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, the Russian population coming from former USSR have a secular attachment to the West Bank without any religious aspects to it. So how do you see that? I mean, the former overlapping and now it's changing in a way.
Well, I don't think that there's one answer to it, except to say that you've touched upon a part of the work that I have to do that I'm going to have to invest a lot of thought on, and that's the relationship between the secular and the religious. And I'll tell you where I am now. And when I was asked by Jenny if I wanted to use auto-visual aids, I said no, and the reason is because they never work. And if they did work, I would have brought one picture, and the one picture would have been the Rubinger photograph of the several days after the war begins in '67, when the paratroopers come to the wall, and there were two pictures. One was the picture that he thought would be the famous one, and it was the blowing of the ram's horn. The other one, which is the picture that actually emerged as his favorite, and he didn't like it artistically, because if you looked at it, there was a picture of the Sabra holding his helmet in his hand, and for me that's the crucial part. And the other paratroopers with their helmets still on, as opposed to Rabbi Goren and the ram's horn. In short, the wall is a religious symbol. What was fascinating is that young Moshavnik, actually, he's not wearing a kippah. Yet the look in his face, and you've all seen the picture, is one of utter reverence. It's some place between reverence and ecstasy. I've actually written about Ben Gurion on his coming up in his Jeep with Moti Hosen as a Weitzman to the wall, and how he goes a transformation also from being against the war to a kind of ecstasy of this transforming moment. The picture of that Sabra is terribly important, because I don't know how deep secular arguments are. I wonder if secularity is not a veneer. Religion is really deep, long. It's been there throughout human history. I mean, I think of the pictures of Arafat. Al-Aqsa was always in the background. But Arafat is a religious Muslim, maybe. But you don't have to be a religious Muslim. Al-Aqsa and the Mount and that story means a great deal to you. I've made it I told Yoram that at the Schusterman Center at Brandeis, I made it a point that as we created an art gallery in our offices, is that we don't have one picture of the wall of religious symbols. I wanted to show the vitality and diversity of Israeli life as it really is today. But I don't know the answer to the question. I think it has to be interrogated. There is a literature, this Charles Liebman and Don Yechia talk about civil religion, and both of them are Orthodox Jews, and they tended to think that eventually the civilness, the secularity of the religion invented in Israel will ultimately not hold and will ultimately dissipate. I like to believe they're wrong, for a lot of very good personal reasons. But I don't know the answer to your question. I think you have to do that in American society too. We have separation of church and state, but every single survey that I've read argue that Americans are a religious people, and that what is the precise relationship between religion and and civil or secular behavior? I really don't know. I think they're interrelated, and if there's anything that would make the book long, that's what would make the book long, but it's what would make it valuable.
But, maybe to elaborate, I think, bringing the Russian issues, maybe we're mixing two issues, the bound to the land or fundamentalism. There are two different forces. Religious, forces are bound to the land. The Russians, I think, that is bound to fundamentalism, which is not necessarily, you will find difference how much people bound, to the land between religious people and Russian. And I think that's the difference. If I want to, I see, Russians are really more fundamental, what we call this, a little bit, lots of discrimination. Maybe part of back to their history in Russia and these things.
But it's very secular. They're secular society.
The idea, the attachment to the land, which one is much, stronger? I think the religious people much more than the Russian, and that's I don't know.
We'll find out.
Is there a chapter in your book?
Boy, I can't wait to read it.
Or in somebody else's book. Well, I haven't gotten to the question yet. Because with all of this attention to the land and the holiness of the land and the worship of the land and the adoration of the land, there seems to be a real ambivalence in Israel's relationship to the land. In the short history of Israel, from the draining of the swamps to the greening of the soil to then going to factories, orange trees, no orange trees, factory, agrarian.
Right.
There is a lot of land schizophrenia going on there.
Well, I think that in terms of the Jewish experience, there is land and landscape. There's a wonderful book about how you can tell a Jewish by the name of Cohen, the University of Oregon, and it has to do with planting trees, maybe the title of it. And it's a wonderful map, takes you on a journey of the West Bank, or Judea, Samaria, whatever your politics happen to be. And wherever you see olive trees, you know that's an Arab settlement. Wherever you see the conifers, you know that that's where the Jews are. And if you look at the economics of Palestine, Israel today, a lot of talk of this land is really fictitious. The United States of America has how many people working as farmers? 3%. Japan is roughly around the same. In fact, you can create an index. The more successful a society, the fewer the people actually work the land. And if one can imagine that for all the Arab talk of my land, it's not to be farmers. Land is a place where you have a house, a skyscraper, or an Intel factory, or a road.
Psychological honor.
Or what?
Psychological honor rather than the
That's
land
right.
itself.
So it really becomes landscape in which you invest in meaning. It's not the traditional historic notion of land as an economic resource. That's the difference between the olive tree and the conifer, or the evergreen. For Arabs, still, it is an economic resource. Increasingly, for Jews in many places, it is not. You know, there's more money in growing high tech than there is in orange trees. And so on and so forth. You look at the fun of kibbutz. The kibbutzim underwent the revolution of the 1950s, when most of the income of the kibbutzim began to come from industry, including tourism. It was in the 1950s, and yet the ideal remains.
The conifer
I
is
think
short-lived.
so. There is something. Your question is real.
Yes.
I think that the attitude towards land is going to change the more sophisticated and the more modern or postmodern the Arab and Jewish population becomes. Land becomes therefore something that serves political ends as well as cultural ends. And it is no less the economic resource than it has been throughout most of human history.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that notion would kind of reverse with the recent uprisings in the Middle East where people are...
I can't hear, I'm sorry.
Do you think that notion would be reversed, that now that like the uprisings in the Middle East are causing a much more nationalistic sense in the people, and like a bigger drive to be educated about what's actually going on versus what leaders are telling them to do?
Fortunately, I'm not a prophet because I live in my own city, and I don't know the answer to that because I don't know the basis for the uprisings in the Middle East. I could imagine those uprisings also in terms of religion, and particularly among Muslims, having the relationship between state and mosque in Islam is far closer than it is in Christianity, which has spent 500 years, including 100 years war and a 30 years war, and a lot of other blood spilled, and separating one from the other. So I don't know the basis of the behavior, the political behavior that is to be found in Tahrir Square or wherever. In short, I can't answer your question because I'm not knowledgeable enough. But maybe somebody else can. Garrett Nada can.
Looking at a lot of other scholars that have looked at different trends in scientist thought, for example, Nadal Shelliff came out with a book, I think about a year ago, where he outlines different evolution paths of revisionist Zionism, religious Zionism, secular Zionism. And what comes out from all of these is that basically they end up talking about the ideologues, which are all Ashkenazi Jews. In the course of your research, in looking at perhaps movements like Shas or whatever, are there any noteworthy subtleties that the Middle Eastern and Sephardi Jewish populations bring to these different narratives, given that their history is much closer to the neighborhood? And so the idea of going back to the land for someone that's from Egypt, it might not be as abstract as someone who's been living in Poland for 500 years. So are there any subtleties that you find in the Sephardi and Mizrahi narratives that sort of color this a bit differently?
I don't know enough to answer your question in a satisfactory way. I can say just a partial response is that I would object to the notion that there's no ideologues or no ideology in Mizrahi Jewry. Just not true. It's an Orientalist view, if you like, and I'm certainly not an Orientalist. Rav Ovadia doesn't have an ideology. His ideology is rooted in religion, but he has come out on any number of occasions with religious legislation that has very practical political purposes or impact. And if you would take Rav Ovadia as opposed to Rabbi Zinni, who comes from another part of the Middle East, you can have a very good dispute. In short, the dispute within Mizrahi religious Jewry is very profound and very angry about a whole host of issues, not the least of which is the politics of the State of Israel. So the dichotomy between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, I would take on the face of it as being a false dichotomy, and Nadav Shelef just may not know enough about what's going on in the yeshivot of the Shas movement, which, as you know, Joseph Ringel does know, and other people that have studied that. So that's as far as I can go with your, why don't you ask me some questions that I can answer?
I want to ask you a question about your. You spoke about the four legitimizing mechanisms for the claim, territorial claim: conquest, treaties, purchase, and investment.
Yes.
And when you spoke about investment, you spoke about work, time, even sweat. You didn't mention blood. Is that part of it, or is it, as I think, an independent element here that should be the fifth one? And if I'm not mistaken, at least from the Israeli side, I don't know much about the Palestinian, you hear more about that element because there was Jewish blood was shed here. Yes. Therefore, it is ours.
Yes. The terms that I gave you came from Locke, and those are the ones found in Marshall. I think there is an additional one, and you see it if you go up to the Galilee, Triple Doors Monument, B'dam v'esh, Nafal b'dam v'esh Yudah tikum, and that with blood and fire Judah fell, and with blood and fire, the notion of blood and being willing to spill one's blood is found throughout. You know the literature better than I do. I just thought of Orit Tzvi Greenberg's notion of that there's one blood, not two. I mean, blood is you're right in your question. It is a very important element, and it has to deal with the notion of sacrifice. And the notion of sacrifice is a religiously oriented or originated idea, but sacrifice, nationalism has embedded within it. And every nationalism that I know, you guys live near Washington. Washington is full of symbols to sacrifice. One of the first things the State of Israel did, and you know the work of this too, is people like Maoz Azaryahu, who have written about when Israel actually lost. Israel didn't win the 48 war. It lost the old city, it lost the most sacred territory, including the Mount of Olives. So where were you to bury your heroes? So you create a new national cemetery. And that becomes Mount Herzl. Or America has Arlington. There's a place for the notables in France. There are mausoleums in Moscow. In short, every nationalism needs to have a place where it can elevate, commemorate, cherish those who spill their blood for the motherland and the fatherland, and Zionism is no exception. A question that go ahead, then after you, yes. You're the chair.
Doesn't matter.
Well, I was really interested about what you said about Nicholas and how they develop a new ideology of pretty much being the only people who can claim the land and using conflict to do it. I know that's what you said.
Right, Article 11. I can read it. I found it right here.
But really, I was wondering about the trend of that historically since Israel began, and whether that has been reciprocated from a Jewish point of view since then. Like, are there Jews who believe it really should be only Jews who live in the land?
Sure. I think that the question, there is symmetry and asymmetry. There is symmetry in, for one good or bad idea on one side, you can find a good or bad idea on the other side. The question is one of balance. And that the role that fundamentalism plays on the Palestinian side is far larger than the role that fundamentalism, at least so far, has played in the Israeli side or the Zionist side. There isn't a hell of a lot of it until the 1980s. I think that would be right in terms of Israel, the role of fundamentalism. and fundamentalism has cost a terrific price. It's the death of a prime minister. It is Baruch Goldstein. It is a whole variety of outrageous acts. The Temple Mount sect. And there are those who think in those terms and who act in those terms. The society, though, as a whole, sees them as outliers. One of the important acts which occurred in Israeli society was making Kahana and his party beyond the pale, and in a sense, making them illegal. One could imagine, one could hope, at least from where I stand, that might be invoked again. But it has been, and it can be. Hamas controls territory, the Hezbollah controls territory, and they have arms and they have weapons and they engage in what they engage in, and it's so there is an asymmetric, the proportions of fundamentalism are different on the different sides. I think that's the statement, not whether or not it exists. Human aberrations can be found everywhere.
Paul? Two different questions and comments. One related to the previous one, not on either of ours strongest expertise. I think you can make an argument that Hamas would, under certain circumstances, accept or deal with a Jewish state on the land. Certainly, I'm not sure if you were saying that they can't abide Jews living there at all. But I will give you the paper I wrote with my co-author, Osama, who's a bit stronger on those sources than we are, and we can discuss that. The second issue is that do you look at or something that's always struck me, Jewish discourse about the land, certainly until the last century, is always the land as a whole. Palestinian discourse tends to be much more about specific parts of the land. On one level, it's obvious Palestinians, their grandparents or others came from specific sites. But do you take anything more about the difference in discourse?
Yeah, the first part is the word is hudna. And that one of the reasons for the outbreak of the last war, the Gaza war, was that it broke out the end of December. Is that in the middle of December that Hamas announced that there would be no further hudna. For many of us Israelis, we would have been happy to have a hudna for 10 years, and then another 10 years, and another 10 years, and one can go through life with hudnas. And so that is a possibility within Hamas, and indeed in Muslim thought. The first hudna occurred around 1300 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's a possibility. In terms of land, you're right in your observation. The Christians don't see all, they thought Terra Sancta is really not all of Palestine. Is that there are certain sites, and there are great disagreements. If you're a Protestant, Gethsemane is the important place. If you're a Catholic, it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And you walk in the footsteps of, now a footstep is a very small piece of land, but that whole notion within Christianity is far more specific than it is in terms of Islam, which does have some sites, and the Mount and parts of Jerusalem. And the expansion to the whole land is an entirely new phenomenon, and people do have their loyalties to their place, their locale. And that's part deeply embedded in the culture. Indeed, my friends who do military history would argue that's why the Palestinians lost the war in '48. is because the villagers didn't go very far afield. They didn't see all of Palestine as their responsibility. They defended their place, or maybe the place of some members of their family. And so there's a kind of localism to the affection and the ties which apparently Palestinians have had, but that's changed. That's changed, and you can read it in English in David Grossman's Yellow Wind, the imagining not only of the place but of the territory as a whole. My son actually did a paper as an anthropologist on the Nakba. His Arabic is wonderful, on the way in which different elements within contemporary Palestinian society enact the Nakba. And the Nakba is becoming far less specific to what happened in my village towards it's being expanded out into what it happened in all of our Palestine. So there's a process of collectivism that's taking place. Since the 1990s. It's a new phenomenon. It's a whole new definition of Nakba, but that's a whole other story.
Last question. The student over there.
Because I didn't answer your first one.
Right.
So I'm just going back to the notion of blood. Would it be wrong to say
Of what? I can't.
Blood. The notion
blood.
of
the
blood.
notion of blood? Would it be wrong to say that Israelis and Jews, they're driven by the concept of the blood that was shed, like throughout their entire history, whether it be the Holocaust or in Egypt or anywhere else, and that the Arabs and the Palestinians are driven by the blood that they will shed to get their end goal.
Wow. Oh, I want to tell you, that frightens the hell out of me. You know, what's gone is gone. One of the most encouraging things that I've ever read about the Arab-Israeli conflict is written by Shimon Peres in his book Towards a New Middle East. And he wrote a very thin book that had the promise for an accord. And at the same time, Netanyahu wrote a very fat book about the reasons why there couldn't be an accord. And the Netanyahu book is full of history. It's full of this outrage, what they happened to us in Europe, then what happened to us in the Middle East. It's a book of outrages. And the wonderful line that comes out of Peres's book is, forget history. Because if you forget history and forget the slights and the slurs, and you think of opening up a new page, then that makes for all kinds of possibilities. So I rather like that, rather than wiping out that which is going to be. But I don't know, but I want to tell you, I'm going to go back in the plane to Boston today. I'm going to go back scared.
Thank you.
Is forget history going to be the concluding statement of your book?
Yes, but not historians.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And we are looking forward to the book.